He fell for his son's girlfriend and took the secret to his grave. David Whitmore had always imagined that by the age of 62, the battles of the heart would be behind him. His hair was silver, his gait slower than in his youth, and his wife Clara had passed away nearly a decade earlier. He had settled into a rhythm of quiet mornings, gardening, old books, and the occasional lunch with friends who were also drifting toward the twilight years of life. Love, in the passionate, unsettling sense, was something he thought belonged to the past, a memory that flared only when he stumbled upon old photographs of Clara laughing in the kitchen or when a certain perfume on a passing stranger caught him unguarded. He shared his modest two-story house with his son Mark, who was 32 and busy carving a career in finance. Mark's life was a blur of late nights at the office, early flights, and constant phone calls. David had grown accustomed to being alone in the house even though his son technically lived under the same roof. He didn't resent it, he only wished Mark would slow down, find someone who truly cared for him, and build a life beyond deadlines. It was on a cool Saturday in early spring that Mark finally introduced his father to someone new. David had just come back from tending the rose bushes when he heard the front door open. Mark's voice carried through the hallway, lighter, almost excited. "Dad, you home?" David wiped his hands on his old gardening apron and stepped inside. His son stood there, tall and neat as ever in his pressed shirt, and beside him was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 27. Her hair, a cascade of chestnut waves, caught the afternoon light, and her smile was bright but not rehearsed. "Dad, this is Lily," Mark said, pride flickering in his eyes. "Lily, this is my father." David extended his hand, expecting the polite shake of someone meeting an elder. But when Lily clasped his hand, her grip was warm, steady, almost lingering. Her eyes met his, and for a brief, inexplicable moment, David felt as though time tripped over itself. Something stirred deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying a melodic softness. "David," he corrected gently, "please just call me David." She laughed lightly, and the sound filled the room like wind chimes. Mark led her toward the living room, speaking quickly, filling the silence with details about how they had met through a mutual friend at a charity gala. David nodded, listened, even smiled, but his thoughts kept circling back to that handshake, to the way her presence had lit the dull corners of the house. Over dinner, David found himself observing more than speaking. Lily was not only beautiful, she was articulate, curious, and kind. She asked David about his garden, about his favorite books, about what life was like when he was Mark's age. She listened with an attentiveness that surprised him. Most young people in his experience gave only cursory attention to the stories of the old, but Lily leaned in, her eyes intent, as though every word he spoke mattered. And in that moment, David felt the strange flicker again, a warmth pressing against the hollowness he had carried since Clara's passing. That night, when the dishes were cleared and Mark drove Lily back to her apartment, David sat alone in the quiet living room. The house smelled faintly of her perfume, floral and subtle. He closed his eyes, and in the silence his heart betrayed him with an ache he couldn't name. He told himself it was nothing, just admiration, just the loneliness of an aging man stirred by the charm of youth. But somewhere in the recess of his mind, a dangerous whisper persisted. "It's more than that." The following weeks wove Lily deeper into their lives. She visited often, sometimes with Mark, sometimes alone when Mark's work kept him late. She brought over homemade muffins, helped David repot plants in the garden, and sat with him on the porch swing while twilight settled across the neighborhood. One evening, after Mark had called to say he would be stuck at the office again, Lily arrived carrying a basket of groceries. "I thought we could cook together," she said cheerfully. David hesitated. Cooking had been Clara's domain, and since her passing he mostly subsisted on simple meals. But Lily's enthusiasm disarmed him. They chopped vegetables side by side, and her laughter filled the kitchen in a way that awakened echoes of a life he thought was gone forever. At one point, she reached for a bowl just as he did, their hands brushing. The touch was fleeting, accidental, but David felt a current run through him. His hand lingered a fraction too long before he pulled away, murmuring something about being clumsy. She smiled, as if she hadn't noticed the turmoil beneath his calm exterior. Later that night, when she was gone and the house was dark, David sat at the edge of his bed, grappling with the guilt of what his heart had dared to feel. This was his son's girlfriend, a woman 35 years younger. To even entertain the thought of longing was betrayal, both to Mark and to the memory of Clara. And yet he couldn't silence it. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon. Mark had flown to Chicago for business, leaving Lily to drop by the house alone. David was reading in the living room when she appeared at the doorway, soaked from the sudden downpour. "You're drenched," David exclaimed, hurrying to fetch a towel. She laughed, brushing water from her hair. "I didn't think it would rain so hard." He handed her the towel, their fingers touching briefly again. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and for a long moment silence settled between them, broken only by the patter of rain against the windows. "Sometimes," she said softly, "I feel like I can talk to you more easily than to Mark." David's breath caught. "Lily. I don't mean that in a bad way," she hurried to add. "Mark is wonderful, but he's so busy, so distracted. You listen, you make me feel seen." He looked away, heart hammering. He wanted to tell her that she had awakened something in him he thought was dead. He wanted to confess that every smile of hers carved deeper into his soul, but he couldn't, he mustn't. Instead, he said quietly, "I'm glad you feel comfortable here. That's all any of us really want, isn't it, to be seen?" She gave him a look, long, searching, almost tender. Then she leaned against the arm of the sofa, close enough that he could smell the faint fragrance of her hair. David clenched his hands, forcing himself to keep still. The rain thundered outside, and inside his chest, a storm brewed that he could neither quell nor escape. That night, after Lily had gone, David stood before the mirror in his bathroom. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. Wrinkles etched his face, his hair had thinned. His shoulders stooped. "What could a girl like her possibly see in me?" he thought bitterly, and even if she did, it would destroy Mark, destroy everything. But no matter how fiercely he tried to reason with himself, his heart betrayed him. For the first time in years, it beat with the urgency of forbidden desire. And David knew, with a dread that hollowed him out, that this was not the end of it. It was only the beginning. The days that followed carried an unease David could not shake. He told himself that the storm within him would quiet if he ignored it, if he focused on gardening, reading, and keeping his distance. But the truth was, Lily's presence had already threaded itself into the fabric of his days, and avoidance was impossible. She was there in Mark's smile when he spoke of her, in the scent that lingered faintly on the cushions where she had sat, in the memory of her laughter echoing against the kitchen walls. One Saturday morning, David decided he would draw a line. Mark had mentioned taking Lily to a brunch downtown, and David resolved to spend the day in solitude, perhaps walking by the lake or losing himself in a novel at the local library. Anything, as long as it meant distance. But fate, it seemed, enjoyed its cruel ironies. Around noon, as David was tying his shoes to leave, the doorbell rang. He opened it to find Lily standing there, a paper bag of fresh bread in her arms. "Hi, David," she said, almost shyly. "Mark's meeting ran late. He asked me to come here first. I hope that's okay." David forced a smile. "Of course, come in." They sat at the dining table, sharing the bread with butter and tea. Lily spoke about her work. She was a freelance graphic designer, and her stories were filled with a kind of creativity and resilience that fascinated David. She had grown up in a small town, worked her way through college, and built a career with determination. She was nothing like the flighty, superficial image David often associated with youth. At one point, she paused mid-sentence and said, "You know, I don't think Mark really understands what I do. He supports me, yes, but he doesn't ask. You do, you listen." David swallowed hard, his throat felt dry. Sometimes listening is the greatest gift we can give someone. Her eyes softened, and for a moment the air between them grew charged, fragile. She reached across the table, touching his hand lightly. "I'm glad you're here, David." His heart leapt, but before he could respond, the sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. Lily pulled her hand back swiftly, her cheeks flushing. Mark entered with his usual brisk energy, kissing Lily on the cheek and thanking his father for keeping her company. David forced himself into silence, even as his mind replayed the brief contact of her fingers on his. That night, sleep eluded him. He tossed beneath the covers, staring at the ceiling, torn between guilt and longing. What was happening to him? Was this simply the desperation of a lonely widower clinging to the vitality of youth, or was it something deeper, something he couldn't explain away so easily? Weeks turned into months. The more David tried to suppress his feelings, the more they grew, taking root in the smallest of moments. Lily humming while watering the plants. Lily leaving behind her scarf, the fabric carrying her scent. Lily sitting on the porch swing beside him, the air between them vibrating with words left unsaid. He began to notice, too, that she seemed increasingly distant from Mark. Mark was often absent, consumed by work trips and late-night meetings, and Lily filled that emptiness with conversations and silences shared with David. One evening in June, Mark called from New York to say he'd be gone an extra 3 days. David hung up the phone with mixed emotions. He was relieved not to face his son's obliviousness, yet he dreaded the time he would inevitably spend with Lily in his absence. Sure enough, the next evening she arrived with a basket of cherries. "They're in season," she said brightly, "thought we could share." They sat in the backyard as twilight descended, spitting cherry pits into a bowl, laughing at the childishness of it. At one point, Lily leaned back in her chair, looking up at the darkening sky. "Do you ever feel like time moves differently as you get older?" she asked softly. "Like you blink and whole years disappear?" David studied her face in the fading light. "Yes, and it only accelerates, that's why every moment matters." Her eyes met his, shimmering in the half-light. "That's why I like being here with you, I feel present, alive." David's breath caught. He wanted to reach for her hand to confess the turmoil in his chest. But before he could, she stood and wandered toward the rose bushes, inhaling their fragrance. "You take such good care of these," she said. "Clara must have loved them." David felt a pang at his late wife's name. She did. She always said roses remind us that beauty is fragile but worth the thorns. Lily turned, her gaze tender. "I think she'd be glad you're not alone." The words hit David like a dagger and a balm all at once. For a moment he thought he saw something more in her eyes, something that mirrored his own longing, but then she looked away and the moment passed. That night David sat on the porch long after Lily had gone, the taste of cherries still on his tongue, the ache of unspoken words heavy in his chest. The tension finally reached its breaking point on a sweltering July afternoon. Mark had been away again and Lily stopped by with lemonade. They sat in the shade of the porch, cicadas humming in the background, the air thick with humidity. At some point their conversation fell away into silence. Lily turned to him, her expression unreadable. "David," she whispered, "do you ever feel like you're living two lives, the one people expect and the one you really want?" His pulse quickened. "Every day," he admitted, surprising even himself with the honesty of his voice. She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "Sometimes I think I'm not where I'm supposed to be." The world seemed to tilt, his heart thundered. Was she saying what he thought she was saying? He opened his mouth but no words came. His voice felt locked behind a wall of fear and guilt. Lily reached for his hand, her fingers trembling. "I don't know why, but when I'm with you I feel something I can't explain." Time froze, the cicadas roared, the lemonade sat forgotten, and David's world narrowed to the feel of her hand on his. Every instinct screamed at him to pull away, to protect his son, to protect her youth, to protect what little honor he had left. But his heart betrayed him, holding on a moment longer than it should. Finally, with a strangled breath, he withdrew his hand. "Lily, we can't," he said, his voice breaking. "This isn't right." Her eyes glistened but she nodded. "I know, I'm sorry." The silence that followed was unbearable. She left soon after and David sat frozen, his chest hollowed out by what had nearly happened. That evening, Mark returned unexpectedly, bounding into the house with flowers for Lily and a grin on his face. "Big news, Dad," he announced. "I think I'm going to propose soon." David felt the blood drain from his face. "Propose," he echoed. "Yes, Lily's the one, I'm sure of it." David forced a smile, though inside he felt his heart splinter. He excused himself quickly, retreating to his room. There, in the solitude of his grief, he realized the full cruelty of his situation. Not only did he love someone he could never have, but soon she would belong to his son forever. And so, David resolved with a heaviness that seemed to crush his very bones that he would bury his feelings deep where no one could ever find them. He would carry this secret like a stone in his chest, unseen but unyielding. He would smile at the wedding, bless their union, and play the part of the proud father. And no one, least of all Lily or Mark, would ever know how his heart had broken. The summer stretched onward, suffocating in its heat and in David's silence. He had locked his secret away, but secrets, he discovered, had a way of festering. They pressed against the walls of his chest, begging to be acknowledged, and every time he saw Lily and Mark together, the pressure grew. Mark's proposal came on a golden August evening. He arranged it on the pier by the lake with candles and flowers and a photographer hidden nearby. David wasn't present, but he heard about it afterward when Mark rushed home, giddy as a boy, to announce the news. "She said yes," Mark cried, his eyes alight. "Dad, she said yes." David forced a smile, his heart twisting. "That's wonderful, son, I'm happy for you." Inside, he was crumbling. He knew this was inevitable, yet hearing it aloud felt like the tolling of a bell. The door had closed forever on the foolish hope he hadn't dared admit even to himself. When Lily came by later with her new engagement ring glimmering on her finger, David congratulated her warmly. She looked radiant, though he thought he detected a flicker of sadness in her gaze when their eyes met. Or perhaps that was only his imagination, clinging to something that was never truly his. The weeks that followed were a blur of wedding preparations. Mark was constantly occupied with arrangements, leaving Lily to coordinate details with David more often than not. They pored over guest lists, floral designs, and seating charts at the kitchen table. Each moment was a knife twisting deeper into David's chest. One evening, Lily lingered after Mark had left for yet another late meeting. She sat across from David, her hands resting on the table, the engagement ring catching the light. "Do you ever wonder if we make the right choices?" she asked suddenly. David froze. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, looking down. "Just, sometimes life feels like it sweeps us along and we don't stop to ask if it's what we truly want." He studied her face, his heart pounding. "And what do you want, Lily?" Her eyes lifted to his, shimmering with unspoken words. For a long moment the air thickened between them, then she shook her head, forcing a smile. "It doesn't matter, I made my choice." David wanted to reach across the table to tell her she deserved more than Mark's distracted affection, that she deserved someone who truly saw her. But the words caught in his throat. He knew what speaking them aloud would cost. So instead he nodded. "Sometimes, loving someone means putting their happiness above your own." Her expression softened, and for a moment he thought she might cry, but she didn't. She stood, thanked him for his help, and left. David sat alone long after she was gone, staring at the empty chair where she had sat, feeling the weight of his sacrifice pressing down on him. The wedding day arrived in early October, crisp and bright, the sky a flawless blue. Guests filled the small church, their voices rising in cheerful chatter. David stood near the front, dressed in his best suit, his silver hair combed neatly. On the outside he was every inch the proud father of the groom. Inside he was unraveling. When the music began and Lily walked down the aisle, David's breath caught. She was radiant in white, her smile luminous, her every step graceful. For a fleeting, dangerous moment, he imagined what it would be like if she were walking toward him, not his son. But then she reached Mark, who beamed with pride, and the vision shattered. Throughout the ceremony, David's hands trembled slightly. He clutched the program tightly as though it could anchor him against the storm inside. He listened to the vows, Mark's confident and rehearsed, Lily's softer, tinged with something he couldn't quite name. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause. David clapped, smiling, even as his chest constricted painfully. At the reception, he played his part. He shook hands, toasted the couple, and even danced briefly with Lily, her hand resting lightly in his. As they moved across the floor, she looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked, his voice husky. "For being you." He wanted to say so much in that moment, that she had been his salvation and his torment, that she had awakened a heart he thought long dead, that he would carry her memory until his last breath. But the words never came. He simply smiled, nodding, and let her slip from his arms back into Mark's. Life after the wedding became quieter, lonelier. Mark and Lily moved into their own apartment across town, though they visited occasionally. David returned to his routines, gardening, reading, the occasional walk. On the surface, nothing had changed, but within, everything had. Every time he saw Lily, now as his son's wife, the ache returned. She remained warm and kind toward him, but there was a distance now, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. They never spoke of what had passed between them, of the words unsaid and the moments too dangerous to name. One evening in winter, after they had come by for dinner, David stood at the door watching them leave. Mark's arm was draped casually around Lily's shoulders, and she turned once, just once, to glance back at David. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat time stood still. Then she turned away and the door closed behind her. David remained at the window long after their car disappeared down the street. Alone in the quiet house, he felt the weight of his years press down on him. He had done the right thing. He had protected his son, preserved the family, upheld his honor. But the cost was a heart that would never quite heal. In the months that followed, David began to age more quickly. His friends noticed it, the deeper lines on his face, the slower movements. The way his once lively eyes seemed dimmer. He still tended his roses, but even they seemed less vibrant, as though reflecting the fading light within him. And yet, he carried himself with dignity. He never spoke of his burden, never let on to Mark or Lily the depth of his sacrifice. He bore it alone, quietly, the way he believed a father should. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit on the porch swing, listening to the wind in the trees and imagine a life that could never be. A life where he had allowed himself to reach for the forbidden, where he had chosen his own happiness over duty. But those were only dreams, and when the dawn came, he would rise and tend the roses again. Because in the end, David knew love was not always about possession. Sometimes love was about silence, about letting go, about carrying the ache alone so that others could remain whole. And so he lived day by day with the bittersweet knowledge that his heart had found love again in its twilight years, only to bury it where no one would ever see. The years slipped by quietly, measured not in milestones but in seasons of the garden. David's roses bloomed faithfully each spring, and he cared for them with a tenderness that few understood. To neighbors, he was the kindly older man who waved from his porch. To Mark, he was the steady father who asked about work and offered advice when asked. To Lily, he was something unnamed, unspoken, yet enduring. Time, however, was not merciful. By his late 60s, David's joints ached and his once sure hands trembled when he held a teacup. Mark urged him to move into a retirement community, but David refused. The house, with all its memories, was both his anchor and his prison. He would not leave it. Lily visited sometimes, more often than Mark, who remained buried in his career. She would bring groceries, tidy the kitchen, and sit with David on the porch swing just as she had in those long-ago evenings. They spoke of small things, the weather, her design projects, the roses, but beneath the words lay an ocean of silence, heavy with everything they never said. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves burned gold and crimson, David struggled to rise from the porch swing. His strength had waned more than he cared to admit. Lily rushed to help, her hand firm beneath his arm. For a moment, their eyes met, and in hers he saw a tenderness that nearly undid him. "You've always been there for me," she whispered. He wanted to tell her then, at last, that she had been his reason to keep living after Clara's death, that she had awakened his heart when he thought it long buried, but he only smiled, patting her hand. "And I always will be as long as I can." Winter was harsh that year. David caught a cold that lingered, settling deep into his chest. The doctor warned him to rest, but rest brought too much silence, and silence brought memories. He moved through the rooms of the house slowly, touching photographs, fingering old books, pausing by the roses now withered in the frost. One evening, Lily arrived alone. Mark was away on another business trip. She made him tea, tucked a blanket around his shoulders, and sat beside him as the wind rattled the windows. "You should have someone here with you," she said softly. "It isn't right, you being alone like this." David chuckled weakly. "I've been alone for a long time, Lily. I've learned how to live with it." Her eyes shimmered, but she said nothing. Instead, she took his hand, frail now, veins visible beneath thin skin, and held it in both of hers. They sat that way for a long while, the fire crackling, the silence more intimate than words. David thought then, not for the first time, how easily he could speak the truth. Just a few words, "I love you," words that might release him from the weight he had carried for so long. But he didn't, he never would, because the cost of such honesty was too great, because love, he had learned, was sometimes a wound you protected by keeping it hidden. The end came quietly. One crisp morning in early spring, David failed to wake. He passed in his sleep, his features peaceful as though the burden he had carried had finally eased. At the funeral, Mark stood tall, delivering a eulogy full of gratitude and respect. Friends and neighbors spoke of David's kindness, his steady presence, his devotion to his roses. Lily, dressed in black, sat near the front. She wept softly, her hands clasped tight in her lap. When it was her turn to approach the casket, she placed a single white rose upon it. Her fingers lingered on the polished wood, and beneath her breath she whispered words no one else could hear. Later, as the mourners dispersed, Lily lingered at the grave. She stood alone, the wind tugging at her hair, her eyes wet with a sorrow deeper than she dared admit. "I loved you too," she whispered into the silence. "I always did." But the man who needed to hear it was gone, and the words drifted into the spring air, unheard, unanswered. Back at the house, Mark found his father's belongings neatly arranged. Among them was a journal, its pages filled with notes about the garden, favorite passages from books, and reflections on life. Mark flipped through it, smiling at his father's meticulous handwriting. But there were no confessions, no mention of Lily, no trace of the forbidden love that had consumed David's final years. That secret remained his alone, buried with him, carried like a shadow to the very end. In the backyard, the roses began to bloom again, vibrant against the warming air. And though David was gone, their fragrance lingered, a silent echo of the love he had tended in secret, fragile, thorned, and achingly beautiful.